My name is Ruth Castal Branco, and I'm a researcher on the Future of Work research project here at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. And I'll be chairing this very topical session co-hosted by both the Southern Center for Inequality Studies and the Society Work and Politics Institute, which promises to stimulate a lively debate about the future of work and the possibilities for reimagining the relationship between work, identity, and security. With us today, we're lucky to have three contributors to the edited volume: William Monteith from Queen Mary University of London, our very own Hannah Dawson from now the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, and Liz Fuchsman from King's College London and SWAP. We are also honored to have two discussants, Tabang Sefalafala from Wits University and Franco Barchiesi from Ohio State University. Of course, as with any book launch, one of the objectives is to pique your interest and inspire you to purchase the book. The publisher, Bristol University Press, has offered a 50% discount, which we have just publicized in the chat. Feel free to post your questions to both authors and discussants in the chat, and we will have about 30 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session. This session is being recorded, so we invite participants to switch off your cameras if you so please. But without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Eddie Webster, our sociology Madala, to offer a few opening remarks and to introduce the speakers. Eddie Webster is a distinguished professor at SCIS and founder of SWAP. In 2009, he co-authored the book Grounding Globalization: Labor in the Age of Insecurity, which was awarded the prestigious American Sociological Association Award for the best scholarly monograph published on labor. In 2017, he co-edited two volumes, The Unresolved National Question, Left Thought Under Apartheid, and Crossing the Divide: Precarious Work and the Future of Labor. He is currently completing a book-length manuscript on work in the shadow of the digital age, a global South perspective on the future of work. So with that, over to you, Professor Eddie Webster.
Thank you, Ruth. Look, mine's just a walk-on part here. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this book launch, co-hosted by the Society Work and Politics Institute, SWAP, and the Southern Center of Inequality Studies, what we call SCIS. I'm especially delighted to welcome one of the editors of this collection, Beyond the Wage, Ordinary Work in Diverse Economies, William Monteith. William has come all the way from the University of London to be with us today. We hope next time, not virtually, but face-to-face, William. The essays in the volume speak very much to the common interest of both SWAP and SCIS in going beyond wage employment to the variety of ways women and men make a living across the global South. In their excellent introduction, the editors argue convincingly that a preoccupation with wage employment stops us from asking questions about what other forms of value-producing activities. There are no universal logics, they argue, but instead many fragments moving in different directions which serve to open up rather than tie down debates on the future of work, unquote. In other words, they're challenging, if you like, a teleological view of work for a more open-ended picture. I would also like to welcome two of the authors of the chapters in this volume, Liz Folkesman and Hannah Dawson, both ex-SWAP postdocs. Their elegantly written and informative chapters illustrate the theme of the book. Hannah on the young men in South Africa who express a preference for self-employment in the informal economy. You're your own boss is the title. And Liz Folkesman, who shows how the long-term unemployed in Namibia retain moral, psychological, and social attachments to wage employment. And what her chapter does raises a very topical question about the possibilities of a universal basic income in South Africa. I'm especially pleased to welcome our two discussants, Franco Barchesi and Thabang Sefolafala, both of whom I had the privilege of working with in SWAP. Indeed, it was Franco who anticipated the central intellectual puzzle raised in this volume. The centrality of wage employment in the official imagination of post-apartheid South Africa, alongside growing wagelessness, precariety, informalization. This was the central theme explored in his celebrated PhD over 2 decades ago. Franco, you've become famous since we had you here. That's great. Finally, I would like to welcome Thabang Sefolafala. Thabang meticulously documented the centrality of wage work in the social imagination of the retrenched mine workers in the gold mining town of Welkom in the Free State. For these long-term unemployed mine workers, wage employment, a decent job, meant social recognition, status, respectability, and the meaning of time. Indeed, what Thabang discovered in his ethnographic account was that losing their employment was, one miner said, like losing a leg. The great strength of this fascinating array of speakers is that they are approaching the future of work from many years of deep and engaged research on the world of work. I look forward very much to the debate and this growing revitalization of the study of work. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks so much, Prof. And without further ado, over to Dr. William Monteith of Queen Mary University of London. Welcome, William.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thanks SWAP and SCIFS for hosting us, to Ruth, Eddie, Thabang, and Franco for generally giving up their time and reflections, and particularly to Hannah as well for leading the organisation of the event. It's much appreciated. So I'm going to start by outlining some of the key premises of the book before providing some detail on the chapters and overall intended contributions. So with those premises, Wage employment is an idea that was brought into being in order to meet the needs of European industrial states in the 18th and 19th centuries. It forms part of a broader mythology of capitalist modernization, which normalizes particular representations of the world, legitimizing institutions, nourishing belief systems, and shaping the various modes of living and thinking that allow for the organization of reality, to quote Felwine Sarr. Through its promise of attaining decency, virtuosity, and independence via the labor market, wage employment served as the moral face of industrial capitalism, enforced on other societies, first through the projects of European colonialism and then of development. However, as the tides of industrialization have receded, they reveal a world not of decent work underpinned by the principles of the standard employment relationship, but of variegated practices of self-provisioning, informal exchange, voluntary work, and forced and reproductive labor. A world in which the labor market has failed to meet the basic needs of the global majority. For example, the ILO currently estimates that less than a third of the global working age population are waged and salaried workers, of which the majority do not have permanent full-time contracts and are often relying on additional activities or side hustles in order to make a living. Yet in spite of these processes, in spite of wage employment essentially being a minority activity among the global working age population, governments and commentators on both sides of the political spectrum continue to revere the miracle of paid employment. Indeed, much of the language we have to describe work continues to be constructed against the ideal of the standard employment relationship, based on the historical experiences of male industrial workers in Europe and North America. Consequently, as Franco has argued, there is a growing mismatch between the official imagination of work and its ordinary material experiences. This mismatch is perhaps best illustrated by the glaring inability of official unemployment rates, much loved by politicians, to communicate anything meaningful about the contemporary realities of work. So 3 years ago, we brought together a group of predominantly early career scholars committed to asking different types of questions about work and its futures. A group of researchers who have conducted long-term ethnographic fieldwork with people engaged in forms of work that we've learned to describe as non-standard, including hustling, street vending, volunteering, and platform tasking, to name but a few. Taking inspiration from James Ferguson and Tanya Lee's recent call for a profound analytical decentering of wage and salaried employment as a presumed norm, our aim with the book was to rethink work from the perspective of the global majority for whom wage employment is not the norm, and in many cases never has been. In this sense, the book takes empirical and theoretical inspiration from regions of the global south in which the history of wage employment is inseparable of that of colonial dispossession and denial of meaningful activity. At the same time, we are interested in the possibilities that theory from the South might provide for shedding new light on questions of work in post-industrial regions of the global North, in which wage work-related nostalgia continues to foreclose alternative futures in which work, identity, and security might be woven together differently. We asked the chapter authors to describe the forms of work they observed, including key activities, relationships, and political stakes, from the perspective of the people performing this work, without falling back on the familiar binaries of formal, informal, precarious, and decent. Taking inspiration from feminist and post-colonial scholarship, we propose to suspend these kind of familiar categories and concepts in the sociology of work in order to understand these activities as examples of ordinary work and advance debates in 3 particular ways. Firstly, through this idea of ordinary work, we aim to broaden the socio-economic imaginary of work by dislocating the figure of the wage labourer as the paragon of meaningful work and dignity, and repopulating the world of work as a proliferative space of difference and plurality. So rather than the invention of particular groups of people in advanced capitalist societies, we argue that the future of work is the product of the inventiveness of people everywhere. It is thus necessarily plural and open-ended. Secondly, we aim to rethink work through the realm of the everyday. Work is part and parcel of everyday life, shaped by the day-to-day variability of socioeconomic relations, values, and practices. Understanding work thus necessitates an engagement with the ways it is experienced and understood in everyday life, its entanglements with other activities, relations, and projects. To quote Kathleen Miller, it's about approaching work and seeing work as a key site of struggle in the sense of what is valued and desired in the living of life. And thirdly and finally, we deploy the concept of ordinary in order to compare lived experience of work across taken for granted conceptual and geographical boundaries. So rather than positing unfolding logics and structures that limit political horizons, the aim is to bring together things from different domains in order to spawn something new. For example, by seeking to understand the activities of an unemployed job seeker in the Welsh Valleys through the hustle of Kenyan sanitation workers, or by seeking to get to grips with the decision of Catalonian activists to quit their wage jobs through the rhythms of Brazilian waste pickers. And we tried to structure the book in a way that reflects the kind of flow of conversations that began at Queen Mary 3 years ago. So in the first section on ruptures, which includes chapters by Tatiana Thiem, Samuel Strong, and Claudia Strauss, we ask, what forms of work are emerging as the tide of wage employment continues to recede in the post-industrial regions of Western Europe and North America? What are the key points of rupture? How do people experience these forms of work, and to what extent are their experiences marked by post-Fordist effect or wage work-related melancholia? The next section then plays with a double meaning of resignation, as both as an agentive act of exit and a submissive state of acceptance in wage-scarce economies. Including contributions from Asiya Islam, Hannah Dawson, Vincenz Bauma Escobar, and Nitya Natarajan, it asks how we might resist shit wages in order to pursue more rewarding life projects. What does it mean to quit wage employment in contexts in which it is scarce? And to what extent is the act of resignation a harbinger of a more fulfilling working life, or simply a bridge to a different form of exploitation? The following section on struggles then examines the evolving relationship between unwaged workers and the state. Including chapters by Annemiek Prins, Mechtil von Vacano, and Mara Nogueira, it asks, how do workers organize to improve their conditions outside of the formal labor struggle? What opportunities exist for political action in wage-scarce economies? What forms of organization are emergent, and how might these be nurtured and transferred into the future? Finally, in the final section, we ask, what possibilities might the global decline of wage employment provide for redescribing work and reimagining the future? What are the key struggles through which people have attempted to generate dignity and meaning outside of the wage? And what possibilities do these provide for redescribing work? So this final section includes contributions by Dora Olivia Vicol and Liz Fuchsman, who we'll hear from in a minute. But first I'll hand over to Hannah, who's going to talk about her chapter on entrepreneurial dreams on South Africa's urban margins.
Thanks so much, William, for this wonderful snippet into this very complex book and giving us a sense of what suspending familiar categories might look like and its implications for how we think about meaning and struggle and emancipatory politics. So now I would like to invite Hannah Dawson, Dr. Hannah Dawson, who's a senior researcher on the Future of Workers Project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. Welcome, Hannah.
Great. Thanks so much, Ruth, and thanks to everyone for joining us today, and especially to our discussants. I'm looking forward to hearing from them and to hear the questions from all of you listening in. So thanks for being with us. And so before kind of jumping into some of the kind of empirical details and some of the arguments I make in my chapter, which is called Be Your Own Boss, Entrepreneurial Dreams on the Urban Margins of South Africa. I just kind of wanted to place this chapter within a kind of wider project that I've been engaged in for some years now. That emerges, because this is one piece of a broader project, and I think that will help put some of the arguments into context. And so, you know, going back to about 2010, I've been doing research in an informal settlement on the outskirts of Johannesburg called Zandspruit, which some of you might know. And this was also very much the focus of my doctoral research. And at a very broad level, what the kind of question I've been examining for some time now is really thinking about the ways in which mass joblessness in South Africa, in particular amongst young people, is is shaping and engendering new forms of economic, social, and political life. What does the fact that, you know, such large numbers of people being outside of waged work, this is not a future to come, this is very much the empirical reality of ordinary life in South Africa. What does this do to social and economic life, and what forms of economic and social life are either made invisible or viewed problematically in our analyses and even in the public debate in South Africa? And so I've gone about this wider project by trying to turn how we think about unemployment on its head, which is often conceptualized kind of negatively. It's defined by what is not there rather than and what is. And if one does that, the questions one asks look slightly different. It's not what someone doesn't have, but what it is they do or do have. And that's really some of the bigger questions that has driven my wider research. But what got me to think about the need to rethink unemployment was an earlier period of research in Zandspruit, where it became clear to me quite soon on to working in Zandspruit that there were types of, you know, low-end, often very poorly paid, insecure jobs available in and around the area of Zandspruit, which is, if you know Joburg, you would know the Kaya Sands industrial area and some of the urban sprawl and suburbanization that's gone on there. So this was not a situation where there was absolutely no wage jobs available. There were precisely low wage jobs available, but these were often the very kinds of jobs that in particular young men were actively trying to avoid. And this became a central curiosity to me, to try and understand the refusal of work in a context of very high levels of unemployment. But more broadly than that, to try and understand what actually shapes, in particular, young people's economic decision-making, both in the formal and in the informal economy. And what this chapter, which I'm so pleased to be a part of this book and that the book is finally out, what this chapter tries to really kind of grapple with is the appeal of working in the informal economy, and or what I call in the book kind of informal entrepreneurship. And more specifically, why at least some young men prefer self-employment in the informal economy to low-end jobs. And in the chapter, what I do is to focus on the life and work histories of two informal entrepreneurs, to kind of examine a series of factors that attract them to informal self-employment, but also that have allowed them to actually, in both instances, to walk away from certain types of low-end jobs and to seek out more entrepreneurial or self-employment kind of economic lives. And so the two people who take up quite a big chunk of this chapter is someone called Hloni, who is an informal mechanic in his backyard. But for a number of years before deciding to run his own business, he worked as a panel beater and as a mechanic for a company or a garage not too far from his home. And what the chapter does is to try and understand his decision to eventually kind of start his own small business. And what I show is that decision was not, as I came to understand it, was that it wasn't necessarily only about being able to make more money, although he was able to do that, although there are certain kind of unpredictabilities about how much money you can make in any given month. But really what he desired was greater autonomy and the desire to, as I call it in the chapter, to mold his life around his work rather than for his work to determine the rhythm of his economic and his social life. The other kind of key character in the chapter is someone called Tato. Tato is a bit younger than Hloni and has been, since he was his late teen years when he was in high school, has been wiring what are known in South Africa as Izinyoka connections or informal electricity connections. This was something he started doing in high school really to kind of fix a problem, you know, when the lines were not working. But after leaving high school and having a short stint in a retail job, he comes to view a kind of skill he has in fixing these electricity connections differently. And he's a key player in what I call in the chapter the kind of commodification from below of the informal electricity network. And in the chapter, I try to trace not only how he comes to rethink the viability of working as an informal connector, as I call it, but also the ways in which he appropriates and uses the entrepreneurial discourse, which has become so prominent, especially in the kind of youth development space, for thinking and also legitimizing his economic agency and his activity. And what I show is that he actually, the informal electricity network is one of the most lucrative informal domains to make some money in Zandspruit. But again, it's not just this, which is what attracts him to, because of course it also comes at huge risk to his life. But what's key to understanding his choice, but also a lot of others, is the ways in which informal economic activity is socially thick. It's a mode of economic life that is deeply dependent upon and embedded in a series of economic and social relationships that offer a kind of social insurance that you don't have in the formal sector. This is not to romanticize the informal economy in any way, but just to say that if you have a casualized, insecure job and you get fired tomorrow, no money comes to you the next day. Whereas the informal economy operates in such a way that there are relationships that allow you to kind of get from week to week when money is more sporadic. So just to say that the chapter tries to do a few things. It tries to highlight how the appeal of self-employment needs to be seen in relation to South Africa's still highly racialized economy, where waged work is very often experienced as degrading, humiliating, and often pays so little when you really kind of consider the cost of getting to work, the transportation costs, but also the social burden, what we call in South Africa, the kind of black tax of having a wage that sometimes makes having a low-end job simply not worth it. Or that's how some young people and young men in particular view this. The second is that what the chapter tries to do is to highlight the social, relational, and reciprocal dimensions of self-employment, which I think are often overlooked in the literature on entrepreneurship, which emphasizes so much this idea of kind of self-reliance. And thirdly, and lastly, is I hope to show at least that, you know, without romanticizing the informal economy and appreciating the ways in which some of these dynamics are gendered in particular ways, that the appeal of self-employment, at least for young men, needs to be seen in relation to, on the one hand, the social relatedness and redistribution that comes from informal networks, this informal social insurance system, but also that it provides a kind of buffer from some of the social demands from girlfriends, children, family that come with the wage. And secondly is this idea of autonomy and the ability to not only escape the kind of racial hierarchies of waged work that still persist in South Africa, but the ability to also weave together working and socializing, work and life in alternative ways. And so, yeah, by documenting how work is refused and the appeal of working for oneself, my aim, I hope, in this chapter is to highlight the types of work, both social and economic, that are often made invisible or problematic in our analyses, and to stimulate new discussions about work, its futures, redistribution, and its relationship to social and political life more widely. And I think this is some of the key questions Liz is going to pick up on her chapter in Namibia. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Hannah, for raising these social relational questions that underlie many of the choices of the economic choices among self-employed men in South Africa. So I'd like to invite Dr. Liz Fuchsman as our next speaker. Liz is at King's College London and SWAP. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Ruth. And thanks so much for all of the organizers of this book launch. I also, before I start, just want to give a special thanks to SWOP, actually, because the research for this chapter was done while I was a postdoctoral fellow at SWOP. And the first iteration of it was actually a paper that I workshopped at a workshop run by SWOP. So the initial comments I got on this chapter were from my SWOP colleagues. So it's really nice that it's kind of come full circle, where I feel like I'm sort of back to where it all began. So this chapter is part of a bigger project that I'm working on, and the project is grounded in a central puzzle, which is the question of why we seem to be so resistant to separating livelihood and employment, or you could even say just livelihood and meaningful activity. And I think you can really see this resistance in the fact that something like a universal basic income or a guaranteed income, which would go some ways towards decommodifying activity, still seems to be sort of glimmering on the horizon, despite sort of constant waves of resurging interest over the past decade. So I'm interested in why that is. And I think others have really done a great job at looking at the role that something like elite interests or more materialist explanations play in this resistance. So for instance, the way that the wealthy might be resistant to greater redistribution, greater taxation, or the way that our current system of wage employment maximizes profit. And I think these explanations are really important. But I think they're insufficient. And so what I try to do in my own work is to focus rather on the way that people's attachment to and longing for wage work also underpins this sort of resistance to further decommodification or to the unwinding of livelihood and employment. And in particular, I'm interested in the kind of moral and social and cultural logics held by those who don't have access to wage labor, and the way that even though wage labor might not be easily available to the people I speak to, they might still have deep-seated attachments to maybe an idealized vision of it. So this particular chapter is based on interviews that I did in 2 rural sites in Namibia. And one of these sites was actually Ojivero, which is the village where a basic income pilot was run in Namibia in 2008 and 2009. And I think in general, Namibia is a really fascinating place to study, the puzzle that I just outlined and ask the kind of questions that I'm asking, not only because of the many dynamics that it also shares with South Africa, including a really well-developed social grant system that exists alongside really high and endemic levels of unemployment and inequality. But again, also this ongoing history of interest and activism around something like an income guarantee or universal basic income, which included a two-year pilot in Ojivero. So the people that I spoke with in Namibia and in Ojivero in particular, which is, I'll just focus on that in this 10 minutes that I have, were often quite supportive of a government policy that looks something like a basic income. Now, not always. I definitely spoke to quite a few people that were also very resistant to it for reasons that I don't have time to unpick here. But even the people in Ojivero who had been part of the pilot, who really supported the pilot and thought that this whole program was an excellent idea, still went on to tell me that given the choice between a government policy that would give them a job and a government policy that would give them something like a basic income, they would largely prefer the job. And in this chapter, I sort of try to unpick why that is and the language and the logics that people use to explain to me why they have this preference and this kind of longing. And in the chapter, I divide these logics into kind of 3 forms: a moral logic, a social logic, and finally what I call a psycho and a physiological view of labor as a source of well-being. And I don't have time now to go into all three of these logics, so I'll just focus on the last, in part because I found it, you know, one of the most surprising and interesting. And this was a kind of rhetoric of work, and in particular busyness. And busyness was a term that was frequently used in my interviews as psychologically positive. So for instance, I spoke to one woman who was a caretaker of 10 dependents, children and grandchildren. And she told me that she would really like, what she would really like the government to do is to build a factory in the village. And when I asked why, she said because she's at home doing nothing all day and she wants to get out and to be active. Now, of course, for many of us, taking care of 10 dependents doesn't sound like doing nothing all day, but she was pretty adamant about this point. And when I asked her why she couldn't, you know, get out and be active, in her words, without a wage job or without a factory, she told me that there's nothing to do here and the village is too small. And I heard this kind of discourse of boredom and this language of there's nothing to do here echoed multiple times in my interviews, including by some young men who not only told me that there was nothing to do and they really needed something to do, but also that work was good because it gives health and it's physically not good to be doing nothing. So there seemed to be a kind of motif of both boredom on the one hand and physicality on the other, a kind of longing for purpose and diversion and also even physical well-being that my interlocutors seemed to think might come with the wage work that they were longing for. And I think this poses kind of an interesting amendment or maybe a challenge to those of us who are interested in reimagining or decommodifying work or thinking about the future of work, because it really underscores the difficulty of spontaneously doing so in a worker society. And I think that this means that we need to not only focus on thinking about forms of distribution, so sort of the material aspects of what it means to live in a society where wage work is insufficient for a lot of people, which is, I think, what we focus on a lot of the time. And of course, it's very important. But also at the same time, imagining and experimenting with new forms of collective engagement and activity, because, you know, Andre Gortz and sort of his classic work on post-work has, I would say, quite optimistic views about human ability for multi-activity, for kind of spontaneous engagement in what he calls non-commodity activities. So care work, work for self, autonomous activity you do just for mastery or pleasure. And I wonder if he was maybe being a little bit optimistic, and maybe this is less spontaneous than perhaps he thought. And that this might not happen organically, but rather that it needs resources, it needs time and structure, and it needs cultivation. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Liz, for insightful presentation at such a timely moment, discussion of the moral, social, and physiological value of work and that implications, not only for the UBI debate, but in rethinking work. So at this stage, we'd like to invite the discussants to engage with the book. And we'll start first with Dr. Thabang Sefalafala from Wits University. I just want to remind the audience that you can post any questions that you have in the chat. And that, of course, if you're interested, if the presentation so far has piqued your interest, Bristol University Press has offered a 50% discount code for this particular session. So without further ado, over to Dr. Thabang Sefalafala.
Thank you, Chair Ruth, and I would like to congratulate the two authors that have just presented the amazing work on Southern Africa. That is Hannah and Liz. So my first comment will be on the question of the refusal of work and entrepreneurship. So the young men of Zandspruit that are described by Hannah, who seem to express a preference for entrepreneurship over precarious work, it's quite clear that what they're doing is essentially expressing a preference over precarious work and not wage work as such. So put differently, it seems that they have not articulated a refusal of wage work, nor have they articulated an appeal of wageless life, at least not yet. What they seem to articulate is that they want wage work and that they refuse precarious work. In this case, the refusal of work seems only applicable to precarious work and not wage work itself. So if, for example, and I'm asking this question, that if they had decent jobs, would they have refused or walked away from the jobs that they had? So in that regard, it seems that there's actually very little celebration of entrepreneurship. Instead, they are using the idea of entrepreneurship to manage and respond to their disappointments with precarious work and its failure to help them realize their aspirations. So the injunction is that entrepreneurship would be able to do that since their first preference, which is wage work, has failed because it's precarious. So rejecting precarious work, it seems, does not mean the same thing as rejecting wage work. And in this case, preferring entrepreneurship seems to be a way of managing and responding to the disappointments with precarious work. So what we see in Hannah's case is a reaffirmation of wage work, and where wage work fails, then entrepreneurship becomes a way of characterizing social relations of hustling. The second comment that I would like to make is with regards to attachments, and that were well articulated by Liz. The attachments to wage labor and the resistance to universal social protection from those who are likely to benefit most from it. When I read this, and I thought that the resistance actually is rather than being counterintuitive, they are to be expected in a society that is so deeply attached to wages. And I thought that what Liz is raising is that these attachments are reflective of the dominant and the hegemonic social structures, the social systems and modalities of thinking, of acting, and being in the world presently. So attachments are bonded compositions. So we can think of attachments as bonded compositions that are constituted by historical processes involving the making of working class cultures. Of course, in Southern Africa, such compositional processes involved colonial intrusion, the violent destruction of African kingdoms, and dispossession. I was reminded of E.P. Thompson's making of the English working class, and the point is precisely that what E.P. Thompson is putting forward is that the making of the working class is precisely about the composition of attachments, the composition of self-identification of workers as workers. So these processes of composition were about the cultivation of people's imagination to think of themselves primarily as wage workers. And so that makes it very difficult to imagine any, kind of post-work society. And of course, the question that arises is, what does the wage mean? So the wage is not just income. The wage is not just money. The wage is entangled with ideas of personhood. And it is entangled with ideas of what does it mean to be human. That is why they reject income from social security, in the form of grants. So the wage becomes, for me, an important puzzle, an important institution to think about here. So the wage signifies this process of composition and entanglement with ideas of personhood that a grant simply cannot fulfill. So in that sense, the poor's rejection of social security is the logical product of a historical process of capitalist making of the working class. So it seems that any successful strategy of post-work has to deal with that, with this desire that has been constituted by processes of capital accumulation. And the third and final point that I would like to make is with regards to the critique of autonomous Marxism that I found quite fascinating from Liz. And in South Africa, as we learned very well from Franco, is that autonomous Marxism has been absolutely important in challenging the normativity of wage work. And Franco's innovation was to infuse autonomous Marxism with Afro-pessimism. And in that way, he was able to provide the analytical tools to question why wage work should be central to the emancipation of Black workers to start with. And in fact, doubts the wages' emancipatory capacity for Black workers. Now, autonomous Marxism provides an alternative in the form of beyond the wage or post-work imaginaries. And my question, and this is a big question, is to what extent do arguments for post-wage work society make sense in contexts like South Africa and Namibia, where you do not have an expansive social protection system as you'd have in other contexts of such as Europe. And if we were to talk about post-work society, what is it that would replace wage work? And what would people be doing? So I thought that those are some of the questions that these chapters made me think of. And congratulations once more. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thabang. And now I would like to invite Franco Barchiesi from Ohio State University to provide your comments on the book. Welcome, Franco.
Thank you, Ruth. I hope you can all hear me, and thank you for the invitation and for organizing this really, I would say, touching, moving, intellectually moving, and personally, I would say, moving event. Personally, in the sense that it's great to be back in South Africa, although it's only virtual. And thank you to Thabang for his very generous words and brilliant comments, which really provide an ideal connection to my own presentation. Okay, let's start. I would start my 10 minutes here, Ruth, if you. Okay, this book is. Thank you. This book is a much needed, impressively documented intervention into the crisis, not only of wage labor, but the whole range of imaginative projects and socio-political norms woven into commodity-producing work. This intervention is all the more urgent at a time like this. I mean, a time of global pandemic in which working under capitalism reveals not only its constitutive precariousness, but also an actual lethality, often disguised in the sacrificial idiom of necessity as in necessary economic activity, an idiom that the language of modernity has recursively and quite deliberately used to reaffirm the disposability of Black, indigenous, and more generally non-white lives. In fact, the COVID pandemic is a reminder of a tragically indissoluble tangle between what is necessary and what is disposable. A tangle within which labor resonates with the question that has quintessentially shaped modernity. And the question is, what is a human being? What is necessary in it and what is disposable in it? The manifold deployments of the imperative to work, as well as its normative coupling with dignity, responsibility, and pride, have revealed that behind the universal allure of such bywords, modernity has not addressed the question of defining the human, and Thabang was quite spot on in mentioning that question. It has not defined this question in ways that are inclusive, egalitarian, or particularly embracing. This book quite usefully takes up that challenge by inviting to a reflection on wage labor, upon which I also insisted in my past work, that is not limited to sociological or policy contingency, but rather addresses the question of wage labor politically by centering precarity not as a pathology, but as a notion that questions existing, commonly accepted definitions, boundaries, and priorities of the social order. Before emerging as a sociological descriptor of changes in the world of work, precarity had long been used, and the introduction makes that point. Precarity had long been used as a political term to analyze modes of social subjectivity emerging within and against the wage relation, and the social order imaginatively premised on it. In Italy, for example, there used to be a whole lot of coordinating committees of precarious and unemployed workers, or the radical feminist experience of the wages for housework campaigns, which have characterized the landscape of social struggles since the 1970s, in fact. The book is also a useful reminder of how the racialized order of colonialism imagined the wage condition as the point of demarcation between intractable and indecipherable Africans, identified as Black, and more manageable natives to whom a highly conditional and constrained humanity could be recognized only on the basis of laboring status, certainly not in terms of equality of citizenship. It is upon the basis of such racialized patterns of domination that Anna Dawson shows in her study of Themsfreight that the articulation of waged employment and self-employment, which neoliberal discourse celebrates as a mode toward the entrepreneurialism of the poor, proves to be far more ambiguous and elusive. For entrepreneurialism itself, I mean, like waged employment is a normative term. It is designed to make stable and governable practices that, while existing within a racially structured capitalist system, by no means reproduce its logics. So entrepreneurialism itself is designed as a term to bring those practices within the fold of capitalism. In Dawson's analysis, one can therefore find the echoes of a long-standing fear, even interdiction against black self-employment, unless black self-employment takes place within legible policy or economic categories. And those fears and that interdiction have shaped, as my current work is now interested in exploring, the transatlantic trajectory and the long period, long duration trajectory from the abolition of slavery to the colonization of the African continent. The liberal praise of economic initiative has coexisted across this long duration with white anxieties about, I don't know, provision grounds and workers-friendly societies in post-abolition Caribbean, strategies of black smallholding and small land ownership in post-bellum US South, as well as the eradication of South Africa's African peasantries and the criminalization of unregulated informality across the continent at large. The implication of different modalities of commodity-producing work, be they waged employed or self-employed, in racial domination and violence, would also perhaps invite to a confrontation with how that violence operates not only in the realm of production, but across the totality of social existence. Liz Fuchsman's chapter on Namibia provides, I think, important indications in this regard by showing how a colonized, racialized space in which visibility as well as activity are made to entirely revolve around subjective dispositions towards the wage results in the complete evacuation of what more privileged and whiter sections of the global working class can still think as social life or leisure. Namibian workers' skepticism towards basic income grants and decommodified provisions reveals not so much an idealization of waged work, Fuchsman shows, but rather a sense that there is nothing to do outside it. Surely not small-scale economies based on livestock or cultivation for local needs, or indeed anything that has not been affected by the violent governmental fantasy that Black Lives Matter only as dependent variables of value creation, or alternatively, heavily policed social stability. I am insisting here on the structuring connection between racial domination and capitalist political economy, indeed the structural primacy of the former over the latter, because I think it is central to analyzing waged work, not only in terms of exploitation and alienation, but of actual violence, which would also allow one to explore the ways in which social practices that exceed wage labor, as this book brilliantly shows, also amount to, or possibly point at possibilities of refusal of waged work. The focus in Anna's and Liz's paper on the worker's self, and this is the key word, I would say, that brings these two chapters together. The focus on the self and self-representation powerfully underpins what is in many ways the book's central, urgent question. How and why is wage labor still this hallowed icon, this revered notion, not only for politicians and policymakers, but such a large portion of progressive imagination of solidarity and liberation? In fact, what explains such a persistence at the core of progressive optimism of an idea of the subject, i.e. the working class, which Marxian critique had, if anything, categorized first and foremost as a position of suffering and abjection, which Marx himself had hoped that the still non-proletarianized could avoid for their own good on the path toward revolution? The imagery of so many Marxist admirers seems to really replicate the religious Christian trope in which the cross is transmuted from instrument of pain into the symbol of redemption. These are, as the book's introduction explains, urgent questions, especially considering that wage labor has been especially considering, and I'm coming to an end here, especially considering that wage labor has been a relative exception even in the history of capitalism, not only have social compacts based on wage productivity been geographically, sociologically, and gender-wise limited to specific portions, but such contingency and exceptionality of wage labor can be detected historically and ideologically as well. Labor historians, for example, tend to forget that in the 19th century Western English-speaking, for 19th century Western English-speaking workers, therefore most settler workers in the colonies, they embraced not so much Marx's idea of the revolutionary working class, but ideas from labor republicanism in the US to the labor liberalism influenced by John Stuart Mill in the UK, which would then prove quite powerful in inspiring 20th century laborism, ideas according to which wage labor was not actual work, but just a degraded version of it, marking either an individual's disposition to dependency or, more importantly, simply a stage in one's life toward self-employment and individual enterprise. Abraham Lincoln actually expressed that vision quite in an articulate way. It was precisely that mindset that informed in post-abolition Americas and colonized Africa the rubric of industrial education addressed to Black workers, deemed laborers, not employees, as education to perpetual servitude, even in the guise of legal freedom, as a racially inherited status, whereby white workers as citizens could move on and harbor the idea that wage labor was a curse or an intermediate step from which there would be a way out, if not in their own lifetimes, at least for their children. This cognitive and epistemic framework seemed to become current again in the long decline of wage-based social compacts, as capitalist command tries to counterbalance dire realities of immiseration and disposability with the mirage of entrepreneurial job hopping or a ubiquitous discourse of professionalism that, and Weber surely could not have seen that, a discourse of professionalism that nowadays applies to Amazon and Starbucks as much as to every recesses of the Uberized academia, all of whose victims are lured to the idea that jobs are indeed shit, but that won't last forever. What allows then the fiction of wage labor to survive? Okay, I'm coming 2 paragraphs. What allows then the fiction of wage labor to survive in such a devastated landscape? What allows indeed the fiction that wage labor corresponds to a mode of subjectivity with attributes of self-determination, choice, strategy, relationality to survive? I suspect that it has a lot to do with something that Marx's category of labor power intuited but could not develop, sans a decisive reckoning with the persistence, even in the guise of freedom, of labor power's haunting antagonist, the slave. Labor power allowed Marx to imagine that only a portion of one's self can be taken away and subjected to the tyranny of another, but not the whole person. That would be a slave, if not only labor, but the entire person was subjected. Labor power marked, in other words, the ontological distinction between the worker and the slave, the tangible, measurable quantity that kept the human from the abyss of social death, as Orlando Patterson put it. Those who, over the past 2 centuries, have used the polemical image of wage slavery, a very powerful polemical image also for the left, evoked a ghost to be conjured away, i.e., that no matter how exploitative, abusive, and alienating, the wage cannot be allowed to become slavery. The wage, that if there is an affective attachment to the wage, that is what drives it, I suspect. That opposition was not merely abstract, nor did it rest on the distant memory of bygone classical slavery. It was, in fact, perfectly cognizant of the fact that slavery, racially defined as such, as well as the afterlife of slavery, as Saidiya Hartman put it, exists and persists under capitalism, even if it is not capitalism that originated it, but rather the gratuitous violence that has been so central to define Western humanist subjects as self-determined beings in opposition to non-white objects. I am on this in agreement with Saidiya Hartman, who writes that, and I quote, representing the slave through the figure of the worker, albeit unwaged and unfree, obscures as much as it reveals, making it difficult to distinguish the constitutive elements of slavery as a mode of power, violence, dispossession, and accumulation, or to attend to the forms of gendered and sexual violence that enable these processes. The category of labor insufficiently accounts for slavery as a mode of power, domination, and production, similarly to how the fungibility of the slave, the wanton use of the black body for producing value or pleasure, and the shared vulnerabilities of the commodity, whether male or female, trouble dominant accounts of gender. Unquote from Saidiya Hartman. In conclusion, I would like therefore to make a case for pushing the study of precarity forward, looking at the antagonisms as well as the articulation between the precarity of the worker and the precarity of the slave in its manifold and contemporary manifestations, as well as what it means to refuse wage labor, not from a place of sovereignty and self-determination, but from the place that Jared Sexton calls the social life of social death, unsovereign, structurally black spaces where worldly redemption is not labor's reward, but fugitivity and antagonistic absolute freedom stand as labor's limits. Thank you. And sorry for going way over time, I guess.
Thank you so much, Franco, for your presentation, and to Thabang as well. So at this point, we'd like to turn back to the presenters, William, Hannah, and Liz, and to give them an opportunity to respond both to your comments and to a couple of questions. And we have two here in the chat. So one for Liz and Hannah. There's a contrast between Hannah's research and Liz's. Hannah's youth had activities they could engage in as informal entrepreneurs and generate an income from. In Liz's case, youth had nothing to do. What accounts for the difference between Hannah's youth and Liz's youth? Why have Hannah's have much to do and Liz's have nothing to do? And then that was a question from Johan Murray. And then from Deborah James to Hannah, it derives from the reading of her wider work. How do the attitude of these mostly male wage refusers contrast with the attitudes of the women who often bear their children? And how do they contrast with those of the outsider, young men, also from the neighborhood, who have fewer social ties there? And since we have no more questions, I'd like to raise a third question. This is for Liz, which is about the ambivalence towards UBI. And I wonder whether there's something else there, which is about the ambivalence of placing one's lot fully or partially in the hands of a state that is often characterized as having been captured by capital or the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. And what are the implications for emancipatory politics, and particularly to the important role that UBI is playing in emancipatory politics of placing that responsibility onto the state? I don't see any other questions yet, but I hope very much that the audience will put them in the chat for our second round, which will include as respondents also Franco and Thabang. Over to Liz. I thought we could start from you and then go to Hannah and then William. Would that be okay?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay.
I feel like in terms of both Thabang's and Franco's really, really wonderful and rich comments, I'm still sort of digesting and processing. So I don't know if I'm ready really to respond or to make an intervention beyond saying, I mean, thank you. It's really interesting and insightful and has given me so much to think about and made me glad that this is being recorded. Maybe just one thing I want to pick up from what Thabang said, which is his reference to E.P. Thompson. And I think that is really very useful because not in this chapter, but in another work of mine, I really draw on E.P. Thompson's way of thinking about moral economy to try to understand why there seems to also be a moral discourse, which is something I didn't get to talk about in my presentation, but this sort of the use of language around work is something that just seems to be an inherent moral good that I hear in a lot of my interlocutors. But I think E.P. Thompson's moral economy framework is also really useful for thinking about this, because it underscores the kind of historical contingency of this centrality of wage work, which Will and the other editors do such a great job of highlighting in the introduction of this book, that if you think about it, if you think about our kind of valorization of the wage through a moral economy framework in the way that E.P. Thompson uses the term, you can then draw a parallel to the way that E.P. Thompson talked about food riots in England in the early industrial period, when people were convinced that grain prices needed to be controlled by the state and not left to the market. And that conviction that grain prices needed to be controlled by the state, I think was as embedded then as a conviction that, for instance, you can't get money for nothing and you have to work for a wage in some moral sense is now. So I just wanted to kind of riff off of Tabang's E.P. Thompson reference. And then to pick up the two questions from Johan. It's funny actually, because Hannah and I have been talking about writing a paper together, trying to put this longing and refusal point side by side. We have an earlier paper about laziness. So we were thinking about this as a follow-up, because that is a tension, and we often talk about the interaction of our work. And I'm sure Hannah has more things to say about that. But one thing I want to emphasize is that I just picked up on a few quotes from my chapter, and there were people I spoke to in Odrivero even, who, for instance, did run. So there's some young women who ran a hair salon, and they actually didn't have this preference for government work programs or for the state to come in and build a factory, but they still actually they told me that they liked the basic income experiment because it let them start their hair salon at the time. It kind of gave them to echo Hannah's chapter. So again, there was kind of this emphasis on productivity and on creating material resources that was still there, that I think actually echoes a lot of the themes that Hannah picked up on. And I just want to also add that I think it's possible to long for something and to refuse it at the same time. I think it's possible to long for a particular vision of that thing and then perhaps even more emphatically refuse it when you're presented with a version of it that doesn't meet that vision or that expectation. And finally, just to Ruth's really insightful and interesting question. Yeah, I do think that this point about how much do you trust the state to ensure your fundamental livelihood is really important. And actually, Hannah and I kind of pick up on it in the paper we wrote together. But I think what puzzles me is the fact that a lot of the people that I speak to for my own fieldwork do seem to place a lot of faith in the state, or at least a lot of demands on the state for other things. A lot of people talk to me about demands for things like housing or even jobs themselves. So it's interesting that there does in fact seem to be a kind of hesitancy or a bit of a distrust or a reluctance when it comes to the ongoing provision of social grants and whether the state can be trusted for that, but still a lot of emphasis on demanding things from the state, including housing and employment itself.
Thanks so much, Liz. Hannah?
Great. Thanks so much to both Tabang and Franco for those fantastic set of remarks. I've had a few more minutes to catch my breath thanks to the reverse order. So I'm going to just try and pick up on one or two things. Really, I just wanted to thank Franco for seeing the kind of book's central question and the bigger, and I'm hoping we'll respond to some of that. But the real question, and also to hear from others who hear, why is wage work still such a revered notion and what that does to social life and the political landscape more widely. The thing I wanted to pick up on specifically that Franco highlighted in relation to my chapter, which I didn't really get to talk to, was around this idea, as he put it, that entrepreneurialism is a normative term. What I do I try to actually, it's a part of the chapter that I didn't really get to talk to, which is to kind of trace the ways in which the informal economy has been conceptualized, both in kind of global, international kind of development practice and talk, but also in the South African context. And when you think about it historically, you see that during the colonial period and during the height of apartheid, every measure was put in place to kind of criminalize and condemn informal activity outside of the realm of the wage, as Franco was speaking to. And now we see an increasing kind of celebration of the site of entrepreneurialism, of hustling as a kind of site of inclusion. And of course, it's important to see how, is it just coincidence that even in the South African government circles, never mind others, there's kind of a revalorization of the informal economy, or what's sometimes called the township economy in South Africa, that this is of course occurring at a time when unemployment levels are at an all-time high. And so to think about entrepreneurialism, not just as the language, not just as a kind of practice or an activity, but as a kind of discourse that has effects, that's being used socially and politically in particular ways. And I think this also has relevance to the kind of renewed calls for a basic income in South Africa. And you see how, on the one hand, there might be some strategic thinking behind evidence that also shows that a basic income often does assist people in having all sorts of informal livelihoods. But there's a real danger there too, that more universal or expansive forms of social protection become legitimized through certain types of so-called productive activity, rather than it being a demand in and of itself. So I just wanted to say thanks for drawing that out, and to say there's more to be said there. In relation to Thabang's really thoughtful, I mean, he's really got to the crux and some of the paradox that I tried to string together through the chapter. I mean, he asked questions around, what it is they're really refusing, and is the refusal of precarious work the refusal of waged work itself? As he put it, if the young men of Hloni and Thato had access to decent work, would they have walked away? And I mean, I think this also begins to tie some connections to some of what Franco was saying, is also to say, it's not directly to Franco's point, but what do we even mean by decent? I mean, both Liz and Thabang are showing how, wage work is never about income. It's about all of these other types of attachments, these ideas. It's tied to personhood, ideas of subjectivity, etc. And so again, what does decent mean? We can ask a series of questions around what decent means. If it's not just about money, if it's about respect, dignity, a sense of progression. And so, I mean, as Franco's older work was so helpful in helping me see some of these things, is that the attachment is not so much to work itself as an actual a reality or activity, but work as an idea, and how strong that can be despite the kind of landscape of devastation, I think, as Franco put it so vividly in his comments. So I think it's important to say, in a way, Thabang is absolutely right. It's the refusal of a certain type of work, but an attachment, is it to work, or is it to a certain that is it work that then is being attached to, or a series of ideas? And I think what I show in my chapter is what I refer to as the kind of enduring power of waged employment as the vehicles to social mobility. It's the kind of legitimate thing you can say as a way to, move up the social ladder in some sense, whereas other modes of accumulation are viewed as less legitimate. And I think we should see it in those terms. And the other being, of course, a long history, which Thabang's own work highlights so beautifully, is the ways in which waged work has been wrapped up in certain kinds of conceptions of gendered personhood, which are not going to be undone quickly. There's complex interrelations there that have come into being over significant periods of time. I could say more. I thought maybe we'll come back to some of Thabang's thoughts on post-work imaginaries. I think there's a lot to be said there, and I think this is why the book's emphasis on the global South, although not entirely, is really important. Precisely because, you know, what will people do in a post-work imaginary? I'm not sure that's the best way to ask the question, precisely because so many people in the South African context don't have work already. So for me, the question is, what are people without work already doing? And this ties directly to Johan's question. Thanks so much, Johan. Around, you know, he's highlighting some kind of, you know, in my field site, you know, everyone is kind of so busy trying to get by, to hustle, etc. And in Liz's comments, there's this idea that we have nothing valuable to do. And I mean, there might be some distinction worth drawing out, but Liz and I would have to talk. But for me, there's an important distinction around, it's around, which again is a central question of the book. It's around what types of work, activity, livelihood, etc. We can frame it even more widely, are made visible, A, and are B, made valuable. And definitely young men in a place like Zandspruit will be viewed by many others as doing nothing, as just sitting. And they themselves can internalize certain kind of the absence of value, that certain types of activity are either non-activity or non-valuable, but actually they are just grafted into another mode of value. So for me, Johan's question raises more complex questions around what we view as activity, as valuable activity, etc. And of course, this is the question feminists have been raising for a long, long time about what types of work count as work. And just quickly to Deborah's question, Deborah knows my work a little bit more widely, and so she is very right to point out that there are important differences around who can and can't refuse work and who can or can't access the more viable or lucrative components of the informal economy. Most people in the informal economy are literally having hand-to-mouth existence. The large chunk of the informal economy in South Africa is people selling small sweets and chips that they've bought from a large retail. It doesn't offer upward mobility. But I do think that these questions look, I've largely focused on young men. These questions look quite different, I think, for young women who find a kind of autonomy in waged work that a young man might not, precisely because that money might give you independence from a certain conception of living under a man, or thinking about what wage or larger sources of income offer you in relation to patriarchal relationships. And of course, a distinction that was often made in Zandspruit around immigrants from other parts of the continent, of whom there are a significant number in Zandspruit, was that we are here to make a living, not to live. I'll stop there. Thanks, Will.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Before we go over to Will, I just wanted to highlight a question by David Watson, a more general question inspired by Franco's comments. Is it better to problematize wage labor, as the book does, or better to problematize surplus value producing labor, which may be wider and arguably more detrimental to society and individuals? This is a different question, no doubt, but may be interesting to think about in relation to the comparison between the two chapters presented. So over to you. I don't know if you want to take a stab at this one as well.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for, fantastic, thoughtful, impassioned interventions by Thabang and Franco, and for the range of questions coming in there. In the online chat, I think, so yeah, in response to David's question, I think I mean, in the book, we're kind of thinking about wage labor, as Franco has talked about it, as a kind of discourse or a package of ideas, and thinking about how they're kind of enacted in different contexts. So going back to Franco's comments, I find his articulation in his book of the wage citizenship nexus, or the work citizenship nexus, really helpful here for thinking about how the wage constitutes not only a kind of modality of work, but also a mode of kind of biopolitical governmentality that shapes the way we think about citizenship, both within states, but also in kind of the formulation of racialized border regimes. And so it brings it to a much kind of broader conversation. And so I think the critique really is of the discourse or the kind of nexus of the wage and the way it's enacted in different parts of the world. But I think the point there around different forms of work is important, and making the point that wage labor does not have a monopoly on bad work. And that lots of recent interventions, thinking by Kate Ma, by Kenyan Sanyal in the Indian context, have shown the ways in which forms of labor that we've come to think of as informal are connected to broader processes of capital accumulation or surplus value producing labor in various ways. To Vang's questions, to what extent is people refusing, or is the refusal one of wage labor or of precarious wage labor? I think that to respond to that, I would ask to what extent there's a difference between those two things insofar as they're presented to people in their everyday lives, particularly in the context in which Liz and Hannah are working. So to kind of turn that question around in contexts in which accessible wage labor is precarious wage labor, what does it mean to continue to center a particular idea of decent wage labor or decent work? What does that do to our kind of politics and our imaginations? And what space does that take up that other potential projects could kind of take the place of? And so in the book, we talk about the ways in which a continued emphasis on decent work and decent wage labor has become a kind of a phantom or a kind of a form of cruel optimism, in Laurent Berlant's words, that kind of conceals more than it reveals in terms of the possibilities that provide us both theoretically and politically. And then moving from that to what comes next, what does the post-work utopia look like? I think part of the intervention of the book that we were interested in is that there appears to be a kind of a fairly Western, the post-work literature as a whole is fairly Western-centric, and amongst its assumptions is this idea that there was a time in which most people had access to paid full-time wage employment. And so it strikes me that there's yet to be a kind of substantial Southern critique of post-work, of the post-work literature. But one thing I do find interesting, which is a critique of kind of leftist imaginations more broadly, is the pressure that people are placed under to describe how kind of desires in the present and activities in the present will be in a fundamentally transformed future, and the impossibility of making that prescription. And I think some of the post-work literature kind of falls into the trap of trying to make that prescription. And I would say it's a kind of dangerous trap, insofar as the prescriptions that arise tend to be reflections of people's own political persuasions and horizons, and those persuasions and horizons are fundamentally northern and to a certain extent shaped by the kind of experiences of post-Fordist white workers in the global north. So they involve, it's striking how much those kind of post-work prescriptions tend to basically be a prescription for what we would currently understand as leisure time. So the kind of flipping around of work and leisure. And so the prescription there is that what we'll be doing is reading, volunteering, kind of lots of kind of broad civil society activities. And I think it's more helpful, and what we try to think about in the book is the idea that the post-work future is already with us in the present, like Hannah's already said, right? And that future is not, the seeds of that future are both kind of utopian and dystopian, and going back to Felwine Sarr and his writings on Afrotopia, the challenge is to kind of recognize the seeds, and those seeds in the present in order to better kind of nourish them. so that they can be transferred into the future. And so I would argue that the activities of the post-wage futures are with us in the present. The question is rather about how those activities are going to be realigned, reorganized, and revalued, and to a certain extent decommodified within that future. And that's maybe a kind of an interesting kind of starting point for thinking through some of those questions. And then go back to Franco. I think yeah, Franco's interventions is really helpful, and going back to kind of what Thabang was saying, for kind of foregrounding the question of race as well within these discussions of wage work, and particularly his kind of Afro-pessimist critique. I think one question I have is, I mean, thinking beyond the book, is the extent to which racial capitalism, and particularly recent writings on racial capitalism, help us move forward in some of these critiques by re-narrating the history of capitalist work as starting not with wage labour, but with forced labour and slavery, as Franco quoted Saidiya Hartman talking about as well. And so, Franco, the extent to which you see, I'd be interested to talk a little bit more about the extent to which you see racial capitalism doing some of the work as moving beyond this kind of wage-centric reading of the world, or the extent to which it also, to a certain extent, falls back on a largely materialist reading of work, or capitalocentric reading of work, that also, to a certain extent, forecloses different understandings of work located more in the realm of the imaginary or the social, such as those outlined by Liz in her chapter.
Thanks so much, William. We have reached 1734, so a few minutes after we're supposed to close, but I think I would like to give the discussants an opportunity to respond in just a minute or two, and then to end with the presenters and your final views before we close. So 1 minute for each person, and we'll close at 17:45. Franco, can we begin with you?
Sure. I mean, this has been a wonderful discussion, and also the responses to the earlier comment. I mean, it really makes me want to go back to this book and reread it one more time. I don't have much more. I mean, it's just a few words in response to Will's last point. Yes, I mean, I do believe that that analysis of racial capitalism that have become kind of on a globalized kind of scale, that have become so influential lately, also in discussions of labor history and labor studies. I think they're extremely useful in that regard, especially to the extent that they project the kind of constitutive imbrication of capitalism within and free labor into not a specific historical period, a specific historical time, but into the present, in fact, into a long duration that reaches into the present. I also think that the modalities of that projection and operate as much at the imaginative and affective, and I would say libidinal level, at the level of the libidinal economy as much as the political economy, in the sense that the contrast between being white worker and potentially free, and being black enslaved and perpetually in servitude, is as imaginative as it is practical. And it is something of which everybody is reminded by the gratuitous violence that today targets blackness quite specifically. It is a matter of, if you want, ontology with the H as much as ontology with the O. And that is something that I think the discussion on racial capitalism, I think, should be more attentive to, quite honestly. I mean, in the sense that this connection between the political economy and the libidinal economy, the material dynamics of capitalism and its imaginative underpinnings. Because in the end, I think that the question of wage labor and how wage labor persists despite its fragility, constitutive precariousness, it is also something about how the modern human subject, I mean, Thabang made that point, how the modern human subject came to be imagined in a certain way, how the modern human subject and attendant ideas of freedom, of capacity, came to be imagined in a certain way. And that would require a type of work that, yes, it incorporates the political economy of racial capitalism, but it is also open to broader, I would say, theoretical, ontological, and philosophical questions.
Thanks so much, Franco. Thabang?
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful discussion once again. Okay, so I'll make two or three comments in closing. And the first one that I want to pick up on is on the question of entrepreneurialism. And so what comes to mind is that it seems that entrepreneurialism is a traveling concept. By that, I mean that it animates all kinds of different discourses. For example, Hannah's participants use the term to define really the hard work of being poor, to define the social relations of hustling. And in my own work, people use the term to disguise their unemployed status. So instead of saying I'm unemployed, they would rather say, I'm doing something, I'm starting some small businesses of some kind. And that is to kind of distance themselves from the negative connotations that come with unemployment. And on the other hand, you've got the state using entrepreneurship as, as a policy instrument. But when you look at Hannah's participants, they seem completely disconnected from what the state is trying to do. For example, in the context in which she conducted her research, and the time during which she conducted that research, which was about 2015, that's when the Gauteng province had the program of township economy revitalization. And when you look at Ploni and Tato, they make very little reference to the state's intervention around TER, around township economy revitalization. So which means that they know about township economy revitalization. They've heard people talking about township economy revitalization, but they are not in any way connected to it. So you have here a group of young people who are disappointed with the promise of work. At the same time, they are really trying to make ends meet by other means. So I get the sense that the young people that we have in places like Zandspruit are really people that have repeated disappointments. And so if you tell them about entrepreneurship, they don't believe you. If you tell them about job creation, they don't believe you. In any case, they believe that the people that get these opportunities are the few that have political connections, or those that know how government works. So when government talks about entrepreneurship or job creation, one gets the sense that in any case, young people don't believe it because of the repeated disappointments of empty promises and non-delivery. The second point that I just want to quickly elaborate on has to do with what William referred to as, what is the difference between wage work and precarious work. And I'll answer this question by referring to Liz's chapter. When Liz asked her participant in Namibia about the kind of work that they would prefer, she mentioned a factory. And I think that is important, because the factory becomes the the archetypal figure of the historical process through which human beings were transformed into a self-identification as workers. So the factory becomes this woman's way of talking about the kind of work that she has in mind, right? So indeed, there is a long history of precarity, as Bakiezi convincingly demonstrates in his wonderful book, Precarious Liberation. But this woman's invocation of the factory is a way of describing a kind of imagined form of work that provides, some kind of security, stability, maybe comes with some benefits, and even unionization. So at least that's what the idea of the factory would, in this context, signify, and by extension, signifying the idea of stable employment. My last comment would be on the question of the persistence of the desire for wage work in a context that it fails to provide the kind of jobs that it promises. So whether the desire for work is a good thing or a bad thing is in itself a debate. But any emancipatory project would have to take seriously this desire for work that currently exists. It would have to take seriously the attachments that Liz describes in her work. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thabang. And so last words from Liz, Hannah, and William in very brief last words.
I just want to say thanks so much for everyone for being with us and for your generous comments and reflections. The wonderful thing about Edit's collection is the amount of different voices that are within it, and it is very much a collective project forged not only by kind of really exciting researchers and colleagues at the cutting edge of some of these debates, but also in many cases friends, which makes it all the more special. So many thanks for being with here, for sharing this moment with us. If you would like to read more a particular chapter or section, but you're unable to access the book for whatever reason, please do send me a message and I'll see what I can do. But thanks very much.
Thanks so much, William. Hannah?
I would just, like to echo thanks for everyone. It's been incredibly rich discussion, and I particularly enjoyed Thabang's final remarks on entrepreneurialism and the complex ways in which and contradictory ways in which it's being used. So thanks for that. And I think both Thabang's work, Franco's work, Liz's work really highlight as Liz puts it in her conclusion, the long-term political work that is ahead in terms of reclaiming some of these concepts, work, identity, community, in ways that go beyond the wage. And I'm looking forward to further conversations. So thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Hannah. And perhaps one of you can share your email in the chat if folks want to access a particular chapter. Over to you, Liz.
Just to echo the thanks. I think the only really substantive thing I wanted to add as a kind of last word is to circle back to Thabang's question in his comments about what would people be doing if they're not working, and I've been thinking about it, and I think to sort of echo Will's point of who gets to answer that question. I think if we are going to ask and answer that question, I think it's a really fascinating one that I've been puzzling over. I feel like as scholars that do empirical qualitative research, I think that actually is our best toolkit to actually go and find people who have refused work and to see what they're doing, and even who have refused productive activity altogether, or productive in the kind of economic sense, or in the narrow economic sense. So going beyond entrepreneurship as well. And I think that some post-work scholars have attempted this. So David Frayne in The Refusal of Work, for instance, does empirical work with people who have actually opted out of wage labor. But most of that work has been done with middle-class workers or former workers who could have a white-collar, decent job if they wanted to. So I feel like maybe the follow-up edited volume to this one is one where we look beyond those Western or global North middle-class people who have chosen to refuse work into other parts of the globe and other ways that people kind of in the cracks are already forging post-work sort of everyday utopias. So I'll just end with that.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of a stimulating discussion. Congratulations to the authors, William Monteith, Hannah Dawson, and Liz Fuchsman for this excellent book and for pushing this collective conversation. Thank you to the discussants for their generous and thought-provoking comments, Tabang Sefalafala, Franco Barchiesi, and Eddie Webster for introducing the session. A special shout out also to Sandiswa Mapukata, Pauline Dlamini, and Kitso Boesele, who really made this webinar happen behind the scenes. And of course, to our audience for your questions and your comments. If your interest was piqued, and I saw that Franco had the book up on the screen just now, you can purchase your copy of Beyond the Wage on the website of Bristol University Press, and we've posted the discount code earlier. And we have a couple of last notes here with emails, so we'll make sure to capture those, and if we can, to circulate the video. So with that, good evening to all, and goodbye.